よし、出発だ。
Oh, damn. That is a shame. Alrighty. This ain't looking too great.
How the government made it illegal to expose the government for the illegal things they have done. What are some of the creepiest declassified documents? The FBI has a team called Ghosts that can infiltrate any home and leave everything to the exact detail as you left it, including replacing dust having exact measurements on where things stood. They partner up with local law enforcement, without their knowledge, and set up staged car crashes or busted fire hydrants in attempts to slow you down. That's how they caught the illegals program Russian spies. They even went as far as to see if they were using wireless signals with their agents. They did. The WikiLeaks documents about the prison surveillance program and about the smart device hacking methods, along with how to set said devices into a false off mode. Every cell phone without a removable battery could easily or may already have this. I worked in a cybersecurity lab for a semester, wasn't my cup of tea and got out of it. But they managed to get these cameras on without the light coming on some devices without modding any hardware. They wrote a paper about it, too. I don't know how they did it. It was kinda scary though, and I always cover cameras now.
I'm just gonna give it a second for the PayPal app to load, and as you can see, there it is. Survey J LLC just sent me 4,000.
Project Acoustic Kitty was pretty weird and creepy if you think about how things would be if they were successful. Basically, the CIA wanted to put microphones and transmitters inside of cats and use them to spy on the Soviets in the 1960s. It cost about $20 million and was a huge failure. But the thought of my own pet being used to spy on me is pretty unsettling. Operation Northwoods. Proposed false flag attacks against American civilians carried out by the CIA and blamed on Cuba in 1962. Thankfully, JFK said no and shut it down. JFK even demoted the guy who proposed this on the spot. Thank God. Also, this means that this idea had to go through a long chain of command with many high-ranking people in the government agreeing to it. This is why many people believe in a 9/11 conspiracy. It surely wasn't the only time a plan of that nature was drafted. Operation LAC biological warfare testing done on U.S. cities. Principally, the operation involved spraying large areas with zinc cadmium sulfide, which is very toxic. Many who were affected died of cancer, and the testing was never followed up on. Most of the neighborhood's genetic makeup was messed up for no reason, and no apologies were made. The same thing was done with cadmium spraying in the UK. It comes up in conversation when people are scoffing at the idea of chemtrails, which is the same idea but exaggerated to make the whole concept appear insane. And I direct them to the BBC articles where the British government happily admits they did it, and people go, well. The speech prepared for Nixon if the moon landing had failed gave me all the chills. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. These two men are laying down their lives in mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding. They will be mourned by their families and friends. They will be mourned by their nation. They will be mourned by the people of the world. They will be mourned by a Mother Earth that dared send 2 of her sons into the unknown. In their exploration, they stirred the people of the world to feel as one. In their sacrifice, they bind more tightly the brotherhood of man. In ancient days, men looked at stars and saw their heroes in the constellations. In modern times, we do much the same, but our heroes are epic men of flesh and blood. Others will follow and surely find their way home. Man's search will not be denied. But these men were the first, and they will remain the foremost in our hearts. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Operation Starfish Prime. Once upon a time, there was a scientist named Van Allen. He was interested in rocketry and space. The Russian government had launched the first artificial satellite into space, Sputnik. Van Allen considered this to be a publicity stunt, as the only thing Sputnik did was beep. Van Allen designed a satellite for the USA that had scientific instruments on board to gather data on radiation in the upper atmosphere. He found out there are moving bands of radiation that surround the Earth, now called the Van Allen belts. Later, the USA was still fighting the Cold War against the Russians. Van Allen had made himself famous with his discoveries, and had the United States military now funding his research. Here is the stupidity and mild cover-up. The US military wanted to give the Russians a show of force that proved they were technologically superior as far as nuclear weapons were concerned. The military came up with the idea of detonating a hydrogen bomb in the atmosphere, just to see what would happen. They went to Van Allen and told him to release a statement saying this was safe, as he was now the expert regarding radiation in the atmosphere. He told them it was a terrible idea. They didn't know what the aftermath would look like, or its effects on the population, or the chemistry would change. They reminded him that they signed his checks and did it anyway against his advice. The government silenced all of Van Allen's criticisms and stated he was fully in support of the experiment and happy with the results. The effect on our cancer rates has never been established. I think there was a lot of creepy things that came out when the East German Stasi files were released after the Berlin Wall fell. All citizens were allowed to view their own files, and many were shocked to find out that their own relatives were informing on them, because they had no choice, and various other things. Katarina Witt, two-time Olympic gold medalist in figure skating from East Germany, had a Stasi file on her starting from when she was 8 years old. She even got spied on by fellow teammate, Ingo Steuer, who was an active informant. Steuer's Stasi past eventually got the best of him when he nearly got banned from the German national team for the 2006 Winter Olympic Games due to his activities. He was eventually allowed to still go, but was forbidden from wearing the German team colors. However, his reputation got restored in 2010, allowing him to wear the German uniform for the Winter Olympics. The leaks of Edward Snowden confirms that the federal government of the U.S. can hack into cars to make assassinations appear to be accidents. They can eavesdrop on your conversations through a car that has the hands-free phone component. Same with phones or laptops. They can even send wireless signals to phones to turn on certain components even if the phone is off or not being used. The CIA and NSA have teams that reroute and intercept laptops, tablets, and desktops to secret locations to install spyware and gets them reroutes back into a delivery company's route. Project Pluto is pretty horrific. The proposed use for nuclear-powered ramjets would be to power a cruise missile, called SLAM, for supersonic low-altitude missile. In order to reach ramjet speed, it would be launched from the ground by a cluster of conventional rocket boosters. Once it reached cruising altitude and was far away from populated areas, the nuclear reactor would be made critical. Since nuclear power gave it almost unlimited range, the missile could cruise in circles over the ocean until ordered down to the deck for its supersonic dash to targets in the Soviet Union. The SLAM, as proposed, would carry a payload of many nuclear weapons to be dropped on multiple targets, making the cruise missile into an unmanned bomber. After delivering all its warheads, the missile could then spend weeks flying over populated areas at low altitudes, causing tremendous ground damage with its shockwave and fallout. When it finally lost enough power to fly and crash-landed, the engine would have a good chance of spewing deadly radiation for months to come. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was subjected to grueling, degrading psychological experiments while he was an underage student at Harvard. At the start of the Cold War, Henry Murray developed a personality profiling test to crack Soviet spies with psychological warfare and select which U.S. spies are ready to be sent out into the field. As part of Project MKUltra, he began experimenting on Harvard sophomores. He sent one student as the control, after he proved to be a completely predictable conformist, and named him Lawful. Long story short, the latter half of the experiment involved having the student prepare an essay on his core beliefs as a person for a friendly debate. Instead, Murray had an aggressive interrogator come in and basically tear his beliefs to pieces, mocking everything he stood for, and systematically picking apart every line in the essay to see what it took to get him to react. But he didn't. It just broke him, made him into a mess of a person, and left him having to pull his whole life back together again. He graduated, but then turned in his degree only a couple years later, and moved to the woods where he lived for decades. In all that time, he kept writing his essay, and slowly, he became so sure of his beliefs, so convinced that they were right, that he thought that if the nation didn't read it, we would be irreparably lost as a society. So, he set out to make sure that everyone heard what he had to say, and sure enough, Lawful's Industrial Society and Its Future has become one of the most well-known essays written in the last century. In fact, you've probably read some of it, although, you probably know it better as the Unabomber Manifesto. The memo from Roger Boisjoli on Oring Erosion, months prior to the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. He essentially predicted, and forewarned, that the rocket O-rings would fail if the shuttle launched in cold weather. The Space Shuttle program was a giant boondoggle, built from leftovers from the Apollo era to cut costs at every corner. The first 2 shuttle flights had ejector seats, but NASA was already noticing that the Space Shuttle
よし、出発だ。 星と深淵を目指せ。 師団の奴らに相手をさせるべきだな。
武勇帝なんぞ取るに足るんわい。武勇帝なんぞ取るに新人冒険者はいつも同じ過ちを繰り返す。
たまにはのんびりするのも悪くないな。
参ったな。新人冒険者はいつも同じ過ちを。 はいつも同じ過ちを繰り返す。
Oh, it came back, I didn't even notice. Oh, crap.
and these women are forced to find their way back home without even knowing the war is over. If they aren't too afraid or ashamed to go back home, they're usually turned away from their families because they are so ashamed of what happened. Gandhi was a racist who forced young girls to sleep in bed with him. He was a sex-crazed creep who slept naked with other men's wives in order to test his abstinence. He also slept naked with his teenage grandniece to test himself. Similar thing with Mother Teresa. She is known for being this pure, spiritual, and good person.
Just hanging out, gaming out,
brought people closer to God,
vibing
so she
out.
denied patients painkillers in her hospitals. She also believed in prayer more than medicine,
With
so
you,
the
man.
treatment wasn't as good as in normal hospitals. Result, her hospitals had more suffering and a really high death rate. My Chinese tour guides who were in their mid-20s did not know about the Tiananmen Square massacre in Kangman. They looked at us time we had 3 heads when we asked about us during our visit. The corrupt Chinese government goes great lengths to censor any mention about 4th June on the internet, and it is not taught in school. I've read an article that said that before the anniversary lots of Chinese websites go offline as to not trigger the firewall that blocks any mention about it. The words that could trigger the firewall could be obviously Tiananmen, but also, that year, or May 35. That the Atlantic slave trade was fed by fierce African tribes enslaving and then trading off less fierce African tribes to the ships that took them to the colonies. Europeans kept dying of disease when trying to penetrate too far inland in Africa. Coastal Africans would capture slaves, or acquire them by trade themselves, and then trade them to the Europeans for manufactured goods, and cowrie shells, I guess. Europeans encouraged wars between groups in Africa, as war would lead to more prisoners of war to be sold as slaves. In America, you're not going to hear a lot about the shady stuff the US government did to its own citizens in the 1950s and 1960s. Project MKUltra was the code name of a secret CIA program that involved all sorts of crazy things that most Americans have heard of but don't really know a lot of details about. And some of the stuff done under this program is so unbelievably weird that MKUltra is a punchline in some circles. And that's just the one that's common knowledge. There were programs set up where the government would inject uranium into people without telling them in order to see the effects, sometimes directly into their sexual organs. You need to dig deep into some weird rabbit holes to find information about stuff like this, and a lot of time you need to sift through all sorts of conspiracy theory BS in order to find the actual story. And even then you can be 100% certain that what you uncovered is real or fake. But even so, it's pretty well established that in the 1960s in particular the US government was up to its elbows in some pretty bad stuff involving its own citizens. And you'll never hear anything about it even in college level courses unless you have some really groovy instructors. I think this is something that generally isn't taught, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. I learned about it in middle school. Then a professor mentioned it in college and no one else in my class heard of it. Then I stumbled upon an article to use as a teacher. None of my coworkers had ever heard of it. It's had a huge impact on safety regulations. Was the biggest workplace tragedy in American history until September 11th and exposed serious shortcomings in corporate management, workplace safety standards, and employees' rights. We learned a lot from that fire, but it's sad that it had to get to that point before we would learn those lessons. That Franklin Roosevelt supported Mussolini and said something along the lines of how he wished he could emulate him back home. Obviously, we can ignore the rest of the effort that the US put into helping the Nazis. Both Roosevelt and Stalin wanted to execute every single captured German soldier. Winston Churchill nipped that in the bud and said something like, "No, I will never execute somebody for fighting for their country." The US was responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of rapes throughout Europe during World War II. The only people ever charged were black people. The US tried to enforce racial segregation within the UK and Australia during World War II, even going as far as ensuring that they did not purchase from any shop that sold anything to black people. This resulted in countless fights between British and American soldiers. One American died in Australia as a result of these fights. The black Americans stayed hanging around with the British and Australian soldiers, which had minimal racism. History, at least when I was taught, has a Western bias. We tend to teach when we discovered certain things or developed certain theories, when we weren't necessarily the first. That's understandable, because that's how we learn those things. However, in a lot of cases there were Arabic, Indian, or Asian scholars who had very similar theories or even discovered things before we did. It gives us Westerns a kind of bias where we think we invented science and astronomy and maths, when that's not really the case at all. It was happening all over the world. Socialism and cultural Marxism were not only failures, but had an absolutely evil history over the 20th century. Not just that, but the Democrat Party has an absolutely evil history. Most American atrocities were committed by Democrats or Democratic politicians. Trail of Tears was Andrew Jackson. Slavery was pushed by the Democrat Party. Andrew Johnson, Democrat who ran with Lincoln, blocked a lot of Republican attempts to bring equal rights to blacks who were freed. The Jim Crow laws were wholly supported by Democrats. The whole American World Police idea was started by Woodrow Wilson. He was also very racist, segregated the U.S. military. The KKK had the Democrats as an ally until the 1930s-40s. Gun control was also originally implemented to keep blacks from owning firearms in Jim Crow states, and Japanese internment was done by FDR. Native Americans weren't granted citizenship until the 1920s. Aboriginals, the native owners of Australia, were not even considered human until 1967. It's how sad most schools don't teach much of the genocide of Native Americans. Most you'll get is the Trail of Tears and Wounded Knee, only cause of Jackson and Custer. The Kuwaitis are going through something similar as far as I've read. A while back they have started registering citizens, only to find out I don't know how long later that some of the ancestors did not register. Now their grandchildren are basically second class and do not possess a nationality or equal rights. In the Philippine-American War, more correctly, the Moro conflict, in one area many villagers fled to a volcanic crater. While there were certainly guerrillas in there, it is clear that they were mostly full of civilians that fled there for refuge, including children. To get ahead of the contrarian comments, the guerrillas in there were definitely not that moral, stole from other villages, history of violence, maybe pro-slavery, but it's up to you to determine where your comfort zone of justification is for what follows. The American governor of the province said that the inhabitants had no intention of fighting from there. They declined to leave or disarm. Important to note, their arms were short swords and spears. As a historical note, the Muslim population of the Philippines was largely not colonized during the Spanish period. So imagine resisting colonial powers for hundreds of years. You've, supposedly, just moved your family to get away from violence, and suddenly the new colonizer on the block shows up and tells you to move. They were pretty much massacred by any definition with modern artillery, grenades, bullets, bayonets, etc. Out of almost 1,000 people, there were 6 survivors. About 20 Americans died. And before we get into a whole discussion over applying our morality over people of the past, let me add that this was a PR nightmare back in the US. Imagine how bad you have to be to outrage the early 1,900 US white public over the deaths of Filipino Muslims on the other side of the world. Sadly, very little of that outrage made its way to public school history. You may get lucky if you're smart enough to get into advanced high school history or have a really motivated teacher, but I had both of those and didn't learn about this, and other massacres, until much later by accident. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more controversial videos. Click the right box for the facts playlist. Let us know in the comments what you think about these facts. Do you think they are true? Can you debunk some of them?
So here's the problem. 48% of Americans aren't invested in the stock market. And 57% of Americans...
Michael Jackson had pretended to be a statue of himself for over an hour to scare these guys waiting in his lobby. What's the most bizarre historical fact you know? Albert Einstein was offered the presidency of Israel on November 17, 1952, following the death of Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann. He declined, saying he lacked the natural aptitude and the experience to deal properly with people to do the job. When Franklin D. Roosevelt died in office, the Manhattan Project, atomic bomb, was so secret that his vice president didn't even know about it, and upon taking oath, Truman had to be briefed on the existence of the bomb. So this is actually something major we have to learn for A-level history. The fact that Roosevelt only trusted people who created the bomb with the information that it existed, emphasized how powerful the bomb was. However, if you want a bizarre fact, then when the Americans created their most powerful explosion, Castle Bravo, the Russians literally laughed and told them they could do better and created something over 3 times as powerful, Tsar Bomba. Biggest FU in history. Ancient Minoans had plumbing, heated floors and running water 3,000 years before the Romans figured it out. They funneled hot air from fires through an opening under the floor. The culture had enough wealthy people, with slaves, and passed down knowledge to have engineers specifically to make houses more comfortable. We always think of technology as a linear progression, but it seems much more accurate to think of periods of advanced, wealthy societies followed by dark ages or recessions of technology and wealth. The civilizations of the Mediterranean Bronze Age collapsed, not to be replaced until the classical Greeks and Romans 1,000 years later, and the Roman civilization was followed by the European Middle Ages, with a return of stability and prosperity coming another 1,000 years later. During the Apollo 8 flight, astronaut commander Frank Borman came down with a stomach bug and ended up vomiting and pooping himself at the same time. There was barf and diarrhea floating around the space capsule, and the other astronauts had to put on gas masks to block the stench while they cleaned it up. In a similar vein, on a space mission, I can't remember which one, before vacuum toilets were invented, a crew member took a poop and didn't bag it up, resulting in a fat log floating about the cabin. On the mission transcript you can see that there was a discussion about who did it, and no one ever owned up. The Roman ruler Nero would make people sit around listening to him badly play the harp for so long that some of the men faked his death to get out of it. Nero got a lot of revisionist slander after he died. Maybe he was bad at music, but really hard to know because most people hated him for all the other stuff he did. He was basically trying to live the rock star life of drinking, parties, and music, which was unbecoming of the emperor. Vikings went as far as modern-day Morocco to fight as mercenaries. Harold Harrod traveled the rivers of Russia to join the Varangian Guard. He raided the length and breadth of the Mediterranean before returning to the north and make himself king of 2 nations, by right of blood in battle. Then he invaded England, and became the second of 3 kings to die in that land in that year. His life was basically a metal album, only without the slow and quiet bits. George Washington spent roughly 15% of his money on liquor. Everyone drank at least hard cider, anything alcoholic, cause water wasn't always good. Knowing nothing about sewage, germs, etc., water was often contaminated then. Drinking alcohol might ruin your liver and kill you by the age of 30. Drinking contaminated water will kill you by the time you're 7 to 8 years old. Drinking alcohol was safer. The man who survived both of the atomic bomb attacks on Japan, Satomu Yamaguchi, was on a business trip in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, when the first bomb was dropped. Being no more than 2 miles away from ground zero, he suffered multiple injuries, but survived. He eventually managed to leave the city by train to return to his home in Nagasaki. On August 9th, Yamaguchi showed up to work and was telling his bosses about his ordeal in Hiroshima when the second bomb was dropped. Although he was a similar distance away from the second blast as he was from the first, Yamaguchi miraculously survived again. Martin Luther hallucinated demons in the bathroom all the time. There is a quite famous legend about him throwing a bottle of ink against the devil. When the emperor declared Luther an outlaw after refusing to withdraw his beliefs, he was kidnapped by his admirer, the Prince Elector of Saxony, and brought into hideout on the Wartburg. There, he translated the Bible from Greek into German, and while he sat there doing this monotonous work, he allegedly saw the devil mocking him. So Luther threw the next thing he could grasp and throw it against the devil, causing him to disappear. I lived in the town next to the Wartburg, and when I was a kid, I often would search for the ink spot that remained on the wall in his room. Unfortunately, the wall itself is quite spotted. When X-rays were first discovered in the 1800s, people found that if you held an X-ray tube up to your eye, you'd see something akin to fireworks. This is a result of the X-rays hitting the molecules in your eye, then exciting the electrons to a higher energy level. When the electrons fell back to their base state, energy would be released in the form of heat and visible light. The light being emitted was what people saw. They had no idea that radiation was harmful. Thus, X-ray tubes became commonplace at parties of rich people. It was once common to sell your pita tanners. They used it to soften hides to make clothing. They started off with used camel urine, but eventually the workers started to use their own, which is suspected to have started in France. One dude's pee worked especially well, and it was because he had syphilis, which used to be treated with mercury. Eventually, after the connection was made with mercury, it was used on its own to treat the hads, and the workers often developed mercury poisoning as a result of working with it. Symptoms of mercury poisoning include tremors, hallucinations, paranoia, and psychosis, and that's where Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter came from. Ancient Greek tragedian Aeschylus, ca. 450 BCE, received a prophecy that he would die by something falling on his head. He spent the rest of his life outside in open fields, where a passing bird dropped a turtle on his head and killed him. The most isolated tree in the world was in the Sahara Desert. It was hundreds of miles from any other tree. Its roots extended hundreds of feet down to water. In the 1970s, it was hit and destroyed by a drunk driver. Imagine being the guy that hit the tree with your car. One of the deadliest, earliest explosion was the Wanggong Chong explosion in 1626, reportedly killing around 20,000 people. The nature of the explosion is still unclear to this day, as it is estimated to have released energy equivalent to about 10 to 20 kiloton of TNT, similar to that of the Hiroshima bombing. The palace in the Forbidden City was under renovation at the time, and over 2,000 workers were shaken off the roof, falling to their deaths. Tianqi Emperor himself was having breakfast in Quanking Palace when the explosion happened, and after the initial quake, all the palace servants panicked with fear. So the emperor started running to the Hall of Union, followed only by a single guard who remained calm, but the guard was later killed by a falling tile. Tianqi Emperor's only remaining heir, the 7-month-old Crown Prince Ju Sejong, died from the shock. In the year 892, Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney was feeling pretty proud of himself after killing his foe, Malbreg. So proud, in fact, that he cut off Breg's head and strapped it to his horse's saddle. Unfortunately for Sigurd, he sat in such a way that caused Breg's teeth to rub against his legs and create an open wound. The wound became infected and Sigurd eventually died as a result. Emperor Norton, the self-proclaimed Emperor of the United States who lived in San Francisco around the time of the gold rush. He lost all of his money buying rice and became homeless. There he started making his own currency and declared himself Emperor of the United States and later added Protector of Mexico to his title. Everyone went with it. Literally, he was once arrested and was later released with an apology due to the immense public backlash. The mad lad even royally pardoned the officer responsible. He got special seating at restaurants and even a statue. Despite being known as insane, he was actually really progressive for his time. He methodically protested anti-immigrant rallies, wanted a bridge connecting San Francisco and Oakland, and kept daily tabs on law enforcement and public infrastructure. In the 90s, following the fall of the Soviet Union, they were low on cash. Therefore, Pepsi accepted 17 submarines, a frigate, cruiser and destroyer as payment for their products, giving Pepsi Company one of the largest navies in the world at the time. The youngest person to ever give birth was a 5-year-old girl. Her name is Lina Marcela Medina de Jurado and she is still alive today. Her son died in his 40s, so she actually outlived the child she gave birth to. To make matters worse, her father is suspected to have fathered the child. That was a confusing and creepy sentence to write. The Italian national football team once ate at one of the most expensive restaurants in Yokohama during the 2002 World Cup and jokingly told the waiter that the food was okay. After hearing that, the owner of the restaurant tried to kill himself, not knowing that the Italians have told a journalist in front of the restaurant their real opinion about the food. It was one of the best things they have ever eaten. Surgery with 300% mortality rate while amputating the patient's leg at the hip. Liston accidentally sliced through the fingers of one of his assistants. That would have been bad enough, but it proved disastrous when the patient's stump turned gangrenous. The cell must have been contaminated, because the assistant became ill and infected, too. The procedure was being observed by an elderly doctor in a dress coat with long tails. In the confusion, Liston cut through the man's coat. He wasn't cut, but because blood was spurting around, the old gentleman didn't know that. Feeling the tug, and seeing himself covered in blood, the man collapsed on the floor, had a heart attack, and died. Within a few days, both the patient and the assistant died. Michael Jackson once had several business associates come to visit him for a meeting. While waiting in his lobby, they sat down near a life-size wax figure of him. After an hour or so of waiting, the statue jumped at them, freaking them out. Michael Jackson had pretended to be a statue of himself for over an hour to scare these guys waiting in his lobby. Stalin received a standing ovation that lasted 11 minutes because the attendees were terrified of being executed if they were found to be the first to stop clapping. The applause went on, 6, 7, 8 minutes. They were done for. Their goose was cooked. They couldn't stop now till they collapsed with heart attacks. At the rear of the hall, which was crowded, they could of course cheat a bit, clap less frequently, less vigorously, not so eagerly. 9 minutes. 10. Insanity. To the last man. With make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope. The district leaders were just going to go on and on applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers. At last, after 11 minutes of non-stop clapping, the director of a paper factory finally decided enough was enough. He stopped clapping and sat down. A miracle. To a man, everyone else stopped dead and sat down, Solzhenitsyn says. That same night, the director of the paper factory was arrested and sent to prison for 10 years. Authorities came up with some official reason for his sentence, but during his interrogation, he was told, "Don't ever be the first to stop applauding." In the Middle Ages, wealthy people would go to extremes to have a pale complexion. Being tan was associated with working outside, thus being poor. To stay lovely and pale, women would eat clay, interleaches sucking their blood, wear makeup made of lead or whale blubber. Some of the stuff people would do to be considered pretty back then is absolutely insane. Al Scarface Capone is the reason milk jugs have expiration dates printed on them. One of his family members drank spoiled milk and got very sick, prompting Capone to use his seemingly infinite influence to convince milk companies in the Chicago area to start putting expiration dates on the bottles of milk. The rest of the United States, and the world, eventually followed suit. That's where they claim it comes from, anyway.
3 days only. Save big on Ring Alarm Security Kits. Go worry-free with whole home security that you can easily install yourself.
Save $80 on the 5-piece kit, $100 on the 8-piece kit, and $100 on the 10-piece kit. Shop now and save on Ring Along. 3 days only at ring.com.
A survivor of the Titanic managed to survive 5 hours in the freezing water only to meet his demise later in life by drowning in a shallow pond. The longest-lasting survivor in the water lasted around 2 hours. The reason he was there for so long was because he didn't want to mess up his hair, so he stepped into the water slowly as the boat went down. Also might be why he survived so long, a dry head. The owner of Macy's department store and his wife were on the ship. He was offered a seat due to his age but refused to go while there were women and children still remaining on the ship. He urged his wife to board, but she refused, saying, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." In the movie they are pictured as the old couple cuddling in bed as the ship sinks. In real life they were last seen on the deck near lifeboat number 8, holding each other. It was one of the first ships with an onboard pool. It featured 2 sea-water pools as well as a Turkish bath. While many people know of the Grand Staircase, many people don't know there was a second, smaller Grand Staircase stopped by a smaller glass dome further back on the ship. The third-class passengers, numbered around 700, only had access to 2 bathrooms. Also, most passengers shared a bathroom, even first class. Only the 2 promenade suites in first class had private bathrooms. While many people know the reason for such a large loss of life is the lack of lifeboats, it's also the case that many lifeboats launched with less than 50% capacity. This is thought to be a combination of many early lifeboats being launched when many people still thought it was a drill, as well as an inexperienced crew attempting to handle a frightened mass of people once it was confirmed that the ship was going under. In the movie The Captain of the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith, is shown meeting his doom aboard the ship on the bridge. In real life no one knows how the captain died. Some report him on the bridge, some say he was seen in his cabin, others say he was in the cafe on board. The best story is the one that says he swam up to a lifeboat with a child in his arms. After pulling the child on board the lifeboat, the people turned to pull him up only to find him gone, presumably slipping beneath the sea. All that is known for sure is that he went down with the ship that fateful night. He was set to retire after the voyage was finished. Many bodies were recovered in the weeks following the sinking, but due to the weather and decomposition many people could not be identified. 2 of the more popular, I suppose that's the right word, unidentified souls was a young boy around age 11 with bright blonde hair, and a middle-aged man with diamonds studded into the lining of his jacket. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more interesting videos. Click the right box for the Confessions playlist. Let us know in the comments what you think about these stories.
So close.